Hi, how are you doing? I hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk with you a little about crimes of interpersonal violence, and this is the start of a section in the textbook, Clenard and Meyer's book on crime. So we start with interpersonal violence, but they start the chapter off with a little bit of a discussion about crime in and of itself. Deviance is structured and not random. So before going into crime, they talk a little bit about deviance, and you could also apply this to crime. That these things involve patterns, and they're patterns that can be studied. So you can use research to uncover empirical patterns that exist. So those patterns are related to the social conditions that people find themselves in and the social position or roles that they employ. So we have to consider these if we want to make sense of crime, violence, and deviance. Deviance is related to some of the most fundamental features of social life. So variations, differences between things like sex, the differences of social class, where you live, and of course age. Age is related to deviance and crime quite closely. Criminal behavior is deviant behavior, and crime results from an act that violates a law, which is a particular kind of norm. So some of this is a little bit referencing previous material that we've talked about. Two ways to examine crime. You can look at a violation of the criminal law and a violation of any law that triggers punishment by the state. You can have three types of crime broadly defined, criminal activity. The first would be common law crimes, and these would be conventional or street crime. White-collar crimes, which are sometimes called elite crimes. And you could also look at delinquency, which are violations of statutes by adolescents. Also, too, I'd like you to know the difference between two ideas, mala in se versus mala prohibitum. What are these? Mala in se would be crimes that are considered bad in themselves. So as an example of this, you could say things that are rooted in tradition, like don't steal or don't kill. Mala prohibita, on the other hand, are crimes because the law prohibits them, and as it says, they're rooted in more public opinion. Don't smoke, for example, in a governmental building today. This is something that public opinion is deemed to be illegal now. So you can ask, which of the following crimes is not a mala in se crime? Think about it for a minute. Rape, assault, burglary, all considered traditional crimes, so the answer then would be speeding. Speeding is something that we have socially agreed upon as a crime in contemporary society. You can also consider offenses that only juveniles can commit, and those are called status offenses. They're not seen as crime because the idea is that children shouldn't be labeled criminals. They should have the chance to rehabilitate. So things like status offenses would include running away from home, truancy. As an adult, I can leave my home anytime I want to. As a child, you have a particular status, which means that you cannot leave your home at a certain hour. So that would be an offense, given the age of the person doing the act. Any crime must incorporate the elements of actus reus and mens rea. These are two different Latin terms also to know in relation to each other. Behavior, and that's in bold there, behavior that violates the law, that's actus reus, a criminal act. But that constitutes a crime only if the actor pursues criminal intent, mens rea, which also means guilty mind. So there are two components, intent and behavior. Under types of criminals, you can consider a criminal career, and that's different from somebody who's a non-career criminal. And it's about the acquisition of criminal norms. And those lead to criminal acts and the individual's view of the criminal behavior. So obviously somebody who has a criminal career would be more committed to that pursuit than somebody who just occasionally does crime, doesn't really have that identity. A criminal career involves a life organization of roles built around criminal activities. So that can include identification with crime. The title of thief, for example, used to be a sort of status among criminals because it also meant that those people had committed to crime as a social role. They wanted to think of themselves as good at that type of thing. So that leads to the last bullet point: progression in crime through the development of increasingly complex criminal techniques and increasingly sophisticated criminal attitudes. So criminals, like many people today, might specialize in a particular thing in order to become good at it and do it well enough to reap rewards from that. So which of the following, from what we just discussed, is not used to distinguish criminals from one another? B, expertise. If you consider assault and murder, there's a data set that is called the National Crime Victimization Survey Dataset, and it's sometimes written there as NCVS. So this is a survey across the United States of people who have been potentially victims of crime. So this is a survey of victims, meaning that these are not police reports necessarily, but people just saying, here's what happened to me. So this is a unique source of data on crime, different from something we'll also talk about, the Uniform Crime Report. The Uniform Crime Report comes from police departments that give that information to the FBI, who compile the report. And those are people who have reported crimes, and that's documented. So the two sources might have some different information about the amount of crime that's going on and the types. So the NCVS is used to report statistics of crimes committed from one year to the next that people who take the survey say happened. And it says, for example, this report indicates there's been a steady drop in violent crime over a 10-year period. Another term used in your textbook, homicide, means to cause a person's death. So I've included a true or false question for you there. Homicides can be either criminal or non-criminal. True or false on that? The answer is that homicides can be criminal or non-criminal. So that statement is true. Another possible question to think about under the idea of crime, murder, assault. Which of those choices is an application of physical force with the intent to do severe bodily harm? The answer is aggravated assault. Assault and battery are often put together, even though they're slightly different in terms of what they mean. And I'd encourage you to look at the legal definitions of these things, because the words that they choose are very intentional in terms of defining a certain type of thing. But assault is specifically that application of physical force with the intent to do severe bodily harm. What's the frequency of assault and murder? Or it says there, homicide. The WHO estimates that there are over 500,000 homicides worldwide in 2000. 500,000. If you're thinking about the United States specifically, the Uniform Crime Report, which again are reports about crime from local agencies that are then given to the FBI, and the FBI summarizes those. The reports to police in the United States recorded 16,272 murder and non-negligent manslaughters in the United States during 2008. So this is, you could argue, relatively rare. If you think about 16,000 some occurrences in a population of, I think we have around 320 million people in the US. Still, though, a very serious crime, and one that we're very interested in documenting and tracking. Police records also indicate there were 834,885 aggravated assaults in 2008. You have all sorts of possible variations in homicide. So the rates can vary by, for example, the country. So let's look at a little bit of information here in your book. It says that a few years ago, let me try that again, a few centuries ago, people commonly settled disputes through personal violence. But those have become rare in most European countries, and they occur at higher rates in Latin America and African countries. So if you think about the United States, there's a section here which asks, is the United States more violent than other countries? And your text concludes, yes and no. The homicide rate in the US is higher than any other industrialized nation. However, is lower than many Central and South American nations. Regions, the South versus the North in the United States. There has been a theory called the Southern Subculture of Violence theory, which contends that because of things like higher rates of gun ownership and a tendency to want to protect a reputation, that those are things that may lead to higher rates of violence in the South. Local differences. You can think of poorer neighborhoods versus wealthier neighborhoods, and crime and its occurrence in those contexts. Race, the proportion of those types of crimes within different racial categories. Social class, age, and sex are all variables related to homicide. If you were to look at regional differences, it talks about the southern states have higher rates. It says that you have higher rates in inner cities. Blacks as more likely to be involved in homicide as both offenders and victims. So that's an important thing to consider. It's an intra-racial crime, typically. Social class, a lot of crimes of violence are heavily concentrated in the lower classes. And it says, regarding age and sex, personal violence in urban areas is highest among young age groups and males. We can also consider interactions between offenders and victims. Most murders and aggravated assaults represent violent responses to social interactions between one or more parties. I once heard a line I liked, which was that murder is often the result of an argument gone very, very badly. It says on this other bullet point, more than half of all murderers know their victims, so they're not strangers to them. You can also say there are higher rates of homicide and assaults on weekends rather than during the week. And there are generally higher rates during the summer than during the winter. Now there's one exception to this, which would be the ideas of the holidays, especially like January and February. You can have also high rates of murder, homicide. in those particular times, usually related to things like bringing people together from families that may not necessarily communicate, the exchange of gifts, so there's more material wealth and possibly fights over that. And also, too, the celebrations sometimes involve alcohol, which inhibits, it is a disinhibiting factor, so those things might lead to higher rates. The relationship the relationship with social situations helps explain homicide and assault crimes, but a person must also understand another characteristic of offenders and victims, and that is differential power. So power is always implicated in a relationship between crimes which are homicide and assault. The distribution of violent crimes suggests that we should also look at subcultures in inner city regions of urban areas. So as I mentioned, the textbook does note that the inner cities, the impoverished areas, have higher rates of these crimes. High income inequality can inspire hostility and frustration. No surprise there, and it also links back to strain theories discussed in an earlier chapter. As people resent their economic and social position relative to those of others. When discussing the development of dangerous violent offenders, some violent crimes result when people characteristically resort to violence in varied situations and circumstances. So if violence is a go-to response, then you have a more likely violent outcome. Rhodes, in particular, indicated 4 stages where people become dangerous, violent offenders. And these are discussed in your text. They're in italics rather than in bold. So I'll go through them and give you some more information than in the overhead. 4 stages of becoming a dangerous, violent offender. So stages would be progressive. And you would start with brutalization. Offenders who experience physical coercion. So they witness the brutalization of others. The second stage, belligerency. Those people conclude that they must typically resort to violence in future relations. Third, violent performances. The person intentionally and gravely injures others. And the final stage, virulency. This is violent performances convincing others in the deviant's primary group to see them as violent people rather than simply capable of violence. Another category to consider, child abuse. The physical or mental injury, sexual abuse, negligent treatment, or maltreatment of a child, under 18 of course, by a person who is responsible for the child's health or welfare and harms or threatens that person. So this is from an act, 1974. And it discusses a rather chilling case in your textbook, an 18-year-old named Chester Miller. It starts, no one seemed to know that 18-year-old Chester Miller was starving to death. So I would recommend reading that because it's a rather harrowing story of child abuse. There are risk factors or family characteristics that contribute to child abuse, and these include the size of the family. Your text says the larger the family, the greater the instance of child abuse. Family income. It says families with an income of less than $15,000 a year are 25 times more likely to have abuse or neglect in them. Single parent households. It says in a single parent household, there's more than 60% chance of children being physically abused. And with alcohol and drugs, in households with these, you have higher rates of abuse of children. Child abuse, you can also think of 2 conditions distinguishing child sexual abuse. One, the abuser is older than the child. Okay, so this is a legal characteristic that needs to be occurring if you want to have the definition of child abuse applied. And that person is in a position of authority over the child. Child sexual abuse involves behaviors such as exhibitionism, fondling of genitals, mutual masturbation, as well as intercourse. And what's really shocking is when you think about all of those things, the rates of child sexual abuse in the United States are rather high because, unfortunately, so many children have some exposure to these types of behaviors. You can also consider intimate partner violence. Both men and women use physical force at about the same rate. Now, that said, women are more likely than men to receive injuries from abuse, and those injuries are requiring medical attention. So that's a distinguishing characteristic of the level of abuse and physical abuse. Spouse abuse occurs largely among members of the lower class, according to empirical research. Elder abuse is also a very important and concerning element, especially as our populations now are getting older. We have what's called the gray wave in the United States, a larger percentage of people who are elderly. Elderly people sometimes experience abuse in nursing homes or while living with younger family members. So nursing homes, you could argue, are places where people have, you could say, a form of institutionalization. There may not be a lot of monitoring with the people who are in those situations, nor may there be monitoring of the people who take those jobs, who are typically very poorly paid. So some of these factors may be related to elder abuse. And also living with younger family members. The problem, you could say, about with families is that sometimes they can be their own isolated forms that other people don't get to see. So patterns of abuse can emerge which are never found. The rate of abuse occurs in 4 to 6% among older people. So keeping the problem in mind in terms of proportion. If you take into account physical, psychological, and financial abuse and neglect. Forcible rape. This results when one person unlawfully compels another to engage in sexual intercourse against the victim's will. Today, both men and women can be victims of rape. In the past, this was exclusively a crime against women. Although forcible rape is often underreported, the FBI recorded 89,000 rapes in 2008. And according to studies, rape can be so badly underreported that half of the cases never get reported to an official authority. What are some patterns with this crime? Rape victims often know their attacker. Young men between 15 and 25 years of age are the population who commit the most rapes. Forcible rape resembles homicide as a predominantly intra-racial crime, and that means a crime within a particular racial category. So white on white type crime, for example. Date rape is a form of rape where the victims of sexual assaults know their attackers, who usually rape them after a date or other social occasion that the couple attends. And date rape has become something that is increasingly focused on in terms of its occurrence. Many date rapes, though, go unreported out of fears of further embarrassment to the victim. Male rape often remains hidden from the police, and that's because of a reluctance to report the crime. This is a heavily stigmatized crime, and males will usually avoid bringing authorities into the situation. However, over 31,000 jail inmates incarcerated in 2008 were victims of sexual assault. And those victims are disproportionately white and heterosexual. There's also some discussion about the political context of rape in your text. The changing conception of rape as a crime of violence rather than a crime of sex has helped dramatically to reorient thinking about the offense. Again, a crime of violence as opposed to a crime rooted in sex. That has changed people's view of it. It used to be the idea that some men especially were so sexual in nature that they had to express that sexuality. Now it's seen as violence being the primary motivator for that. Many observers regard forcible rape as a political act as well, because it reflects an exercise of power by one group, males, typically, and in most cases, over another group, females. So politics always involves power, and it's the power of males over females that allows some people to consider rape a political act. Why is rape underreported? For many good reasons. Rape is emotionally upsetting and deeply humiliating to victims. Victims also encounter stigma, not simply the stigma of having been raped, but also the stigma of having their past scrutinized to see whether they, quote, brought it on themselves. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's what sometimes people think about with rape victims, very unfortunately. It says victims sometimes must deny implications that they consented to these sex acts by either resisting too weakly, too little, or leading on their assailants. And I have the idea here of blaming the victim. What did you do to potentially cause this type of thing? Which is, you could argue, very much the wrong kind of question to be posing. Other reasons for rape being underreported would be some victims' stories are doubted by police officials, and that is remarkably true. The process of giving the police report involves a lot of scrutiny and a lot of questions because the police want an accurate report, but that can lead the people giving the report to feel like they're not being believed, which is in itself a very big problem. Some victims face embarrassing questions about the crime, and courtroom treatment may involve previous sexual experience in an attempt to discredit the victim's story that they were raped and not willing. So someone may bring up the number of partners somebody's had in order to say that, well, they bring this on themselves through their actions. There have been legal reforms for rape cases. These involve changes in past definitions and official responses to rape. So as an example, the inclusion of men as a possible category of people who can be raped now. Victim-precipitated crimes are where the victims had agreed to sexual relations, but then retracted their consent before the act or failed to resist with sufficient strength. And so this is a question today as to consent and when consent is given and consent perhaps being withdrawn during the act. That may fall under a legal category of then constituting rape if the person does continue without consent. There's also the notion of shield laws. These are laws that prohibit publication of rape victims' names. So there are laws concerning journalism. And believe it or not, in the United States, it was only in the 1970s and 80s that these types of shield laws were enacted. Before those times, the victims' names could be published. And that, again, of course, would probably inhibit people from saying this is a crime that happened to me. There are theories of rape. Psychiatric and psychological approaches to rape stress causes like rapist hidden aggression. And also, some theorists have looked at classification schemes, trying to organize different categories of rapists. Nicholas Groth is mentioned, and his category of power rapists, and others have categories such as sexual rapists. Two kinds of sexually aggressive men have also been theorized, those who admit to sexual contact and are able to define that contact as rape versus those who admit sexual contact, but they deny that it was rape. Sociological theories advance several explanations. Rape represents an extension of legitimate violence in society. To some extent, our society is very violent and glamorizes it in movies and television, and you could say through violent sport. And we have very traditional definitions of masculinity which promote the idea of males controlling things like the family and other people in the family. Again, some of those things may be changing, but I'm talking about traditional ideas. Rape varies also with the degree of gender inequality. Increasing equality between sexes reduces the likelihood of rape. Sociological theories advance several explanations in rape as well. These include things like rape results in part from depictions of women as sexual objects in pornography. The objectification of women has been seen to be perhaps a cause of rape. Rape results from value conflicts as well in the larger society. Society expresses an extreme, severe reaction to murder, aggravated assault, and forcible rape, and that is through the enactment of strict law. This is really the way that we can summarize this material, that there are very strict laws and sanctions against these crimes in particular, because they're violent. Legal penalties can include lengthy prison terms, and in some circumstances, even execution, particularly for capital murder. So violence as a form of deviance is well established, and we can look at empirical evidence to show us patterns in these types of deviant acts.